On the left is my brother, Bradley J., and that's me on the right. This is my mom, Mary Jo, and this is the story about how they helped me get started on the Appalachian Trail. We actually left my cabin and headed north on the Allegheny Trail. As you can see, the terrain was steep and rugged right off the bat. We hiked 10 miles that first day out of Watauga State Park and camped at a local campground. This teepee was one of the unique features there. And we decided to pitch our tents so that we could test our gear in what would prove to be 3 straight nights in the 30s. That following day we continued north 11 miles into Seneca State Forest. My brother was a stronger hiker and I often found myself following behind his footsteps.
Downhill?
Yeah, it'll be downhill all the way to the pavement.
We continued hiking north along the ridges of Buckley and Marlin Mountains. Our destination was my 97-year-old aunt's house, who lives in Durban, West Virginia. We crossed into Seneca State Forest and worked our way to the southernmost shelter. We took advantage of the fact that the shelter had a fireplace and built a fire to stay warm and be able to cook. Bedtime came early most nights, and here we had our tent set up inside the shelter. Hey, oh no, you'll be up before me.
What time we getting up? Just whenever?
Whatever.
You having fun out here?
What's that?
You having fun?
Yeah, dude, this is a good trip. First 2-night backpack trip ever. On day 3, my brother and I hiked 10 more miles to complete our journey on the Allegheny Trail. Here we are passing the northernmost shelter in Seneca State Forest. My brother hiked a total of 33 miles with me, and after day 3 he flew back to Utah. I was saddened as him and I hadn't spent that much time together in the woods since we were very young men. And I really enjoyed him helping me get my camping gear in order. That following week I would be starting on the Appalachian Trail solo. Here's our last night in West Virginia. Here I am in Pearisburg, Virginia, getting started on the Appalachian Trail. There was a steep ascent out of Pearisburg, about 3 miles, that covered over 3,000 vertical feet. I passed several waterfalls and rock formations on the way. This is Angel's Rest and Overlook over Pearisburg. And I continued about 10 miles south along the ridge lines, stopping to enjoy the view and have some lunch when it was needed. My pack, when loaded with 4 days of food and 2 liters of water, weighed 33 pounds. And that included a tent, a sleeping bag, and an air pad. Here's an example of the green tunnel, as often you were just completely surrounded by vegetation. My first trail magic was some beef jerky someone gave me. I camped solo the first night along a roadway, just eager to test my gear. The following morning, had some freezing rain move in, and I took a break at a infamous shelter. Here is Wapiti Shelter. There was a murder that took place here in the 1980s. And I'm just hiding out from the rain, as I often did. I would blow up my air mattress and take long breaks during the day. Moving forward, we crossed over Kimber Creek, and I hiked about 12 miles that first day and another 12 the second day. I camped solo the first night and decided to do the same on the second night. I found a large campground and set up my tent. Took time to gather firewood, as I often did. I was often in camp early and would take time to build a fire and cook. Breakfast was often a protein bar and coffee, which I would make on my stove that used alcohol fuel. And here we are, the third day, hiking towards the only suspension bridge that can be found on the trail. There are many stream crossings, but this one happens to be very unique.
Day 3 on the AT. My knees are feeling great, so there's a smile on my face. Here we go.
So fairly quickly, I got into the Virginia farmland. A lot of the cows had very young calves. I opted to go around this herd. You can see spring is working its way in with some of the wildflowers starting to bloom. As you're walking along the AT, you follow a series of white blazes. Here you can see one on the tree, and sometimes they indicate direction of travel. This is Jenny's Knob Shelter, where I opted to stop on my third night. Here I am crammed in the shelter with 8 people and very little sleep. Between the hardwood floor and the wind and being shoulder to shoulder with the other hikers, I got very little sleep that first night in the shelter. The following day, I would cross I-77 and work my way into Bland. Here I am stopping for lunch at the Overlook. I camped that first night behind the general store there at I-77 crossing. I had a shuttle into Bland the following morning and picked up a mail drop at the post office. I would mail myself resupplies to get food in areas where there weren't necessarily grocery stores. Here I am after my first resupply, working my way through a burn area and over the ridges south out of Bland. I crossed Laurel Creek. Now, most of the water on the AT that I encountered was running spring mountain water. This larger creek is a little bit of an exception, but you would gather your water in a smart water bottle and filter it. Here my dog, BB, and my beautiful fiance, Nicole, stopped to see me. They were traveling home from North Carolina and got off the highway to spend lunch with me. That following day, I camped at Jenkins Shelter. Here's my setup for the night and packing out first thing in the morning. We did have a small bear in camp that night, but it was really no trouble. One of my favorite parts about walking on the trail, especially southbound, was walking in the mornings. I rarely encountered other hikers and often would walk miles along these ridge tops solo, enjoying many different rock formations, and a lot of other turned great as I worked my way through my second week of hiking. A little more on my tent. I had an REI 2-person passage tent. I had an REI 30-degree sleeping bag and one of their inflatable air pads. There was an example of a piped spring. This is the Overlook to Burke, where we camped on the top of Chestnut Knob. Another early morning hike here, and often I would stop for lunch, really before the sun was high in the sky. Lunch usually consisted of a packet of tuna or chicken. The tuna and olive oil happened to be one of my favorites. And for dinner, I would boil water and make a mountain house meal, easily consuming both servings that would come in the bag. Here my mom came to visit as her and Johnny were on their way home from North Carolina. And yet another campsite. I crossed over Big Walker Mountain and was glad I was packing an extra change of clothing. Most of my clothing was synthetic. My socks were wool, and I was wearing a pair of Merrell trail runners. I had a pair of trekking poles, which I really used. I think they gave me a lot of power on the uphills and traction on the downhills. Moving through the mountain laurel and rhododendrons was always interesting. And here we are crossing onto private farmland. There was always an interesting contraption or ladder to get you over the fences without disturbing them. The blazes would be on these white posts as you walk through the open land, and often sunscreen was required to get through even these short openings. These walk planks were used whenever the trail crossed bogs or wetlands. Here I am working my way into Marion, Virginia. I camped at the Shatfield Shelter. Often I would tent right outside of shelters, as there would be the company of other hikers and generally a privy. I was generally in a good mood early in the morning. However, as I approached Marion, the rocks began. There would be all types of rocks thrown right in the trail, almost as if someone had scattered them there on purpose. In Marion, I picked up my second mail drop, which included 4 days worth of food, and enjoyed the overlooks as I continued south. Crossing Comer Creek, I was averaging 10 to 12 mile days, and in order to keep my knee pain in check, which I was beginning to suffer a little bit of knee pain, I would take more breaks and enjoy the scenery. Here the trail took a sharp turn from one road to another. Rarely would the trail follow forest roads, but it did occasionally. Here we are continuing through the meadows. I would often stop to stretch. Other hikers told me that stretching would surely help me do more miles and feel better. The trail was always steep. It almost never contained flat sections unless you were crossing a road or through town. Often steps or rock steps would assist as you worked your way past many different waterfalls. I worked my way into the higher elevation forests and had a unique eye on all kinds of different bugs and vegetation and wildlife. The high forest was one of my favorite. Here I stayed the night in Hurricane Mountain Shelter with 2 other hikers, and again had a pretty sleepless night. I opted to stay in the shelter because we had 30-mile-an-hour winds that night, which was appropriate for Hurricane Mountain Shelter. The following day, I continued towards the Virginia Highlands, which would be my first 6,000-foot peak, crossing a variety of streams and a variety of footbridges. Here we're entering into the Virginia Highlands State Park, and you can see we're above the tree line here. The trail was often very well worn, sometimes 4 feet wide and 6 inches deep, as you can see here. Only a few miles into the state park, I encountered my first wild ponies at the northernmost shelter. Here they are, and they're absolutely beautiful to see. I did spend quite a bit of time with the ponies as it was such a interesting experience. Here's a little bit about how they're managed, and you can go see the wild ponies for yourself. I suggest that everyone do it on their bucket list. As I worked my way into the Highlands, I started having some pretty tough days. My left knee began to hurt around mile 10, and then around mile 12, my right knee would join in. Started taking a pretty serious regimen of ibuprofen, which other hikers comically referred to as vitamin I. I was stretching 5 to 6 times a day, and that seemed to provide some immediate relief and also relief for the next 24 to 48 hours. Even with all this, I would find myself occasionally limping into camp. This day in particular was a day I remember limping into camp. I was really incredibly worn out over these rocks and had to stop and take many, many breaks. Just south of Mossy Gap, we set up camp here for the night. And I remember being able to hear the wild ponies and pulling up clumps of grass right there outside of my tent as I slept. Here I am about 9 p.m., which was what was referred to as hiker midnight. Most people were in bed. This is morning coffee. And last snapshot of possibly one of the more beautiful campsites I enjoyed. Continuing the next morning up over Mount Rogers proved incredibly difficult as the rocks were nonstop. These big granite faces, or sometimes small boulders, sometimes medium-sized boulders. And the trail would often just peruse right through the most difficult terrain, often making no attempt to avoid obstacles. Here I am on my second day in the Highlands. These are longhorn cattle and more wild ponies. A few more views as I work my way south out of the Virginia Highlands State Park and off of Mount Rogers. This here was my second favorite trail photo I took of the trip. And right as you cross Mount Rogers, there's Thomas Knob Shelter, which is a double-decker shelter. It has a first and a lower floor, often packing 15 to 25 people, depending on the weather conditions. The wind and rain and snow can get pretty intense at those elevations. Behind the shelter is a spring where I again encountered more wild ponies. I saw dozens of wild ponies, dozens of longhorn cattle while I was there. And after 2 days of the Virginia Highlands, I worked my way into the Lewis Fork Wilderness and continued south to Damascus. As I worked my way down off of Mount Rogers, the rocks continued and so did my knee pain. I was limited to about 10-mile days, which really put me in jeopardy for finishing the entire section I want to. My mileage would greatly depend on the terrain. Sometimes the trail, as you can see here, would be gentle and rolling, may be switchbacked up a steep grade, and other times it would just be rocky and brutal and seem to travel along the most difficult path. I remember again this day, even though the views were absolutely beautiful, I found myself limping into camp again that night. Here I am camped alongside a rock to be protected from the wind. It was amazing what a good night's rest would do. I often woke up with very little leg and knee and hip pain and was able to continue. Here is another example of a fence crossing. The terrain would vary greatly in one day. I think this day I was on a bald in a pine forest, in a hardwood forest, in a pasture land. And along with the varying terrain, your mood could vary as well. Some days were easy and simple things, really seemed to keep you in high spirits. And other days were physically and mentally demanding. Here I am working my way down toward the Virginia Creeper Trail, which the AT travels along for about 5 miles as it works its way into Damascus. I wanted to talk about hiker etiquette real quick. There was a variety of hiker etiquette, including leave no trace, including the way you built and maintained and put out your campfires, including the way you let people pass who were on an uphill track. Huge variety of insects on the trail. And here is a difficult ledge right before coming into Damascus. This is my last campsite before Damascus. And a closer look at my REI Passage 2, which means two-person tent. The rhododendrons started to bloom as I worked my last few miles into Damascus. I took a 0 in Damascus so that I could rest my knees, resupply, do laundry. I stayed at the Virginia Creeper Trail. Here's a survey pin. There were many of these along the trail. Okay, guys, part 2 is coming up, so I hope you enjoyed part 1.